The fire crackled steadily through the night, the orange glow casting long, twisted shadows across the clearing. Ben lay awake, his body sore from the day's exertions. His eyes, heavy with fatigue, darted between the flickering flames and the dark silhouettes of the trees that bordered the small camp. The wilderness around them seemed alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of night animals, the eerie whistle of wind moving through the branches, but the night felt unnaturally still, as if the forest was waiting. Ben's stomach still rumbled faintly, the warmth of the meal from earlier now a distant comfort, a fleeting memory. Though the older man had kept his word and given them food, Ben knew that this fragile peace between them wouldn't last long. The price of survival was high, and it was never a matter of just earning the right to eat and rest. It was something deeper, something unspoken, lurking beneath the surface of every exchange. The stranger, who had been silent for most of the evening, sat a few feet away, his eyes never straying far from the fire. His posture was stiff, his face unreadable, but there was an intensity in the way he studied the flames, the way his fingers drummed softly against the hilt of his knife. Ben could feel the tension between them, a subtle undercurrent that hummed beneath the quiet of the camp. "You don't trust him," Ben said quietly. His voice barely more than a whisper. The stranger didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at Ben, his gaze lingering for a moment before returning to the fire. For a moment, Ben thought the question would go unanswered, but then the stranger spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "No one trusts anyone out here," he said. "Not really. Not if they want to survive." Ben swallowed, the weight of those words sinking into his chest like a stone. He had suspected that survival in the wilderness meant learning to rely on no one, but hearing it spoken aloud made the truth all the more unsettling. "What's his story?" Ben asked, nodding toward the older man, who was sitting with his back to them, still watching the fire with that strange, almost predatory calm. The stranger shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing as if considering how much to reveal. "He's been out here longer than either of us," he said finally. "A lot longer. Don't know exactly what brought him here. Could be he was lost, could be he came looking for something. Either way, the man's seen things. Done things." Ben felt a shiver crawl down his spine. The older man's eyes, those deep, calculating eyes, seemed to carry the weight of 100 untold stories. But it was more than that, the way he moved, the way he observed, as if everything around him was a potential threat or a resource to be used. Ben had seen men like him before, people who had learned to survive by becoming part of the land, by adapting to its rules. But the price of that adaptation was steep, and it always left a mark. Ben didn't know what to make of the older man yet, but one thing was clear: he wasn't here by chance. He had a reason for being in these woods, a purpose that went beyond mere survival. And that made him dangerous. The older man shifted, breaking the silence with a rough grunt. He stood up from the fire, stretching his limbs before walking slowly toward the edge of the clearing. The faint sound of leaves crunching underfoot echoed through the night as he moved with the quiet ease of someone who had spent too long in the wilderness to care about making noise. Ben watched him, his mind racing. The man hadn't said much about what was going on in the woods, and Ben had learned by now that silence often spoke volumes. There was a truth buried somewhere beneath the layers of caution and guardedness, and Ben could feel that he was on the verge of discovering it. "Where's he going?" Ben whispered, turning to the stranger, his voice barely audible. The stranger's eyes flickered toward the older man, then back to Ben. He leaned in slightly, his voice low but firm. "Doesn't matter," he muttered. "He'll be back." Ben wanted to press further, to ask what the stranger meant, but something in the stranger's tone told him it was better to leave it alone. For now, they had bigger problems. They had food, they had warmth, but the true cost of their survival hadn't yet been revealed. The fire crackled again, sending a spray of sparks into the air. Ben couldn't help but feel a nagging sense of unease. There was something off about this whole situation. The forest had a way of distorting reality, making you question your instincts and your choices. Every time he thought he had a grasp on what was happening, something shifted, some new danger rose from the shadows. It wasn't long before the older man returned, emerging from the darkness with a bundle of sticks in his arms. He approached the fire and added the dry wood to the pile with a swift, practiced motion. The fire flared briefly, casting a fresh burst of warmth across the camp. The older man didn't say anything as he sat back down, his eyes once again fixed on the flames. Ben couldn't help but watch him, his mind still churning with questions. What was this man hiding? And why had he offered them food and shelter in the first place? Finally, Ben couldn't take the silence any longer. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying an edge of curiosity. The older man's head turned slightly, his eyes glinting in the firelight. His lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Does it matter?" he asked, his voice soft but sharp. Ben hesitated, caught off guard by the question. It was a simple answer, one that Ben knew he should have expected. Out here, names didn't hold much weight. They were just words, a flimsy part of identity that could easily be discarded. Out here, survival was all that mattered. The older man's gaze remained fixed on the fire. "You can call me whatever you want," he added, his voice turning colder. "But just remember, out here, names don't matter. Only what you do." Ben felt a chill run through him, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. The older man's words hung in the air like a warning, a reminder of the harsh truth about life in the wilderness. Every action carried consequences. Every choice could be your last. "Why help us?" Ben asked, his voice more forceful this time. "You don't know us. You don't owe us anything." The older man's expression didn't change. He continued to gaze at the fire, his face impassive. But for a split second, Ben saw something flicker in his eyes, something dark, something deeper than simple indifference. "Nothing in this world is free," the older man said slowly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "Everything comes with a price. And right now, the price of your survival is something you're not ready to pay." Ben felt a knot tighten in his chest. The words seemed to sink into his bones, and for the first time, he understood. The wilderness didn't just take lives, it took pieces of the soul. It made you barter with things you didn't even know you had to give. And it never gave anything back for free. Ben's mind raced, but the truth of the older man's words settled over him like a heavy blanket. This wasn't a story of survival where someone simply rescued you from danger. This was a game of survival where everyone was playing by their own rules, and if you weren't careful, the cost of your existence could become more than you were willing to pay. The stranger, who had been watching the exchange between Ben and the older man, stood up abruptly, his posture stiff with impatience. "We've had enough of this," he muttered under his breath, his eyes hard. "We need to keep moving. Staying here any longer won't help us." Ben looked at him, torn between staying with the older man, who might offer them more survival tips, more food, or leaving before they got pulled deeper into whatever twisted game the man was playing. His gut told him they needed to leave, but he wasn't sure if it was the right decision. There were too many unknowns, too many dangers hidden in the shadows of the wilderness. "We can't stay here forever," Ben said softly, almost to himself. The words were less of a declaration and more of a question. Did they stay or go? Did they trust this man who spoke in riddles and mysteries, or did they leave and face the wilderness alone again? the fire crackled again, its warmth a sharp contrast to the cold uncertainty that settled in Ben's chest. The older man said nothing more. He simply stared at the fire, as if awaiting their decision, knowing that whatever they chose would come with consequences. In the end, the choice wasn't theirs to make. The wilderness would decide. The forest always decided.